on to the next delegation, and that is David Millard Haskell talking about the critical race theory motion. And your 10 minutes, sir, starts right now.
Thank you, and good evening to the chair, trustees, and all the members of the board. My name is David Millard Haskell. I'm a social scientist, researcher, and professor, but tonight I'm here representing the Waterloo Region chapter of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. The short form of our name is the acronym FAIR, and our website is Fair for All. Our chapters are all across the US and Canada. As an organization, FAIR and its members are dedicated to promoting anti-discriminatory, pro-human values that unify society. In particular, I'm here tonight on behalf of FAIR and the local parents who are members and supporters because we're very concerned about the imbalance and what many see as censorship related to discussions about anti-racism education in our board. In violation of the bylaws that are meant to govern this board, we see that we are finding the concerns of parents are not being heard. For example, Section 4.3 of your Waterloo Public Board bylaws say, trustees shall be expected to A, make decisions in a manner which is open, and B, approach all board issues with an open mind, and C, respect different points of view. These legal expectations have been ignored. My comments tonight must be viewed in light of those legal requirements. Specifically, my comments tonight will focus on last week's refusal by the majority of trustees to allow any exploration into the teaching of white privilege and the influence of critical race theory within our board. Of course, I'm referring to the motion by Trustee Watson that was voted down, and also to the unfair comments that accompanied that rejection. And while this delegation tonight, I'm focusing on the recent rejected motion, it appears there is a troublesome trend. Just in the past few months, we've seen severe and shocking examples of censorship by this board against those wanting to raise alternative views and express concerns that many parents are feeling. But let me get back to the issue at hand, the refusal of this board to allow any exploration or even allow discussion on white privilege or critical race theory in our public schools. What was most shocking about last week's stifling of inquiry were the comments of those voting against the motion. The comments were shocking not because, well, yes, because they contravened your very own bylaws that insist on open-mindedness and respect for different views. But additionally, they were shocking because they reference virtually no facts. Those watching at home saw that the opposing board members relied primarily on highly emotional language and extreme anecdotal claims to force their will. What should have been a civil discussion at times seemed much like emotional coercion. In fact, rather than rationally debate the merits of instruction in white privilege or critical race theory, we had trustees angrily shut down discussion, claiming that the topic was too emotionally offensive to continue. For example, instead of trying to explain why she was against transparency when it came to what was being taught on critical race theory and white privilege, one trustee simply proclaimed, "We're better than this." I had to wonder, better than what? Better than those who want to get the facts on the issue? I watched, disappointed, as the leaders of our educational system insisted that doing more research and committing to more study to better understand an issue was a bad thing. As a social scientist, I was doubly frustrated that the leaders of our board shut down Cindy Watson's motion, and with it, the chance to find out more about white privilege instruction. Because if you had allowed her motion to proceed, you would have discovered some very concerning peer-reviewed studies. But that exploration was not allowed. So tonight I'll share with you some of the research that is able to be found if you look for it. I'll be submitting these studies for reference to the trustees so they can read them fully. Let me begin. In 2019, a study was published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology General. Dr. Aaron Cooley of Colgate University was the lead researcher. The aim of the study was to measure the effect that lessons on white privilege would have on the attitudes of students. Well, the study found that teaching lessons on white privilege did not make students more sympathetic to students of color or people of color. In fact, it did nothing positive, but it did increase hostility toward poor whites. The researchers concluded, quote, learning about white privilege reduces sympathy, increases blame, and decreases external attributions for white people struggling with poverty. In short, they found teaching about white privilege does not do good, but it does do harm. Now, here's a second study that also shows the harm that comes from teaching white privilege. And it was just from last month, in May. A study was published in the journal PLOS One, spelled PLOS One. The lead researcher was Christopher Quarles from the University of Michigan. The research involved an experiment to see how introducing the concept of white privilege would affect online discussions on issues specifically related to racial equity. The researchers found that introducing the concept of white privilege shuts down open discussion and lowers support for racial harmony. They concluded, quote, mention of white privilege seems to create discussions that are less constructive, more polarized, and less supportive of racially progressive policies. Furthermore, they stated the concept of white privilege made previously supportive whites less engaged in the conversation and led to less constructive responses from whites and non-whites. Now I'll turn to a third massive study. In 2021, a study was published in the Annual Review of Psychology. The lead author was Elizabeth Payluck from Princeton University. Payluck and her colleagues didn't just do a single study, they did a meta-analysis of over 400 existing studies. Their goal was to see if mandatory instruction in diversity, equity, and inclusion works to decrease prejudice and increase harmony. Because instruction about white privilege is one of the core modules in most diversity training programs, this meta-analysis is highly applicable here. After analyzing the outcomes of the over 400 research papers, Payluck and her team concluded this. Despite the bold claims made by people developing and facilitating this kind of instruction, the average impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion training is zero. And while no good is coming from it, there's even more evidence such mandatory equity and diversity instruction does harm. Let me tell you about Harvard professor Frank Dobbin and what he concludes. Commenting on the hundreds of studies that have measured the effects of diversity training, including instruction on white privilege, Harvard sociologist Frank Dobbin agreed it does not do good. But writing in the July 2016 edition of the Harvard Business Review, he concluded, quote, a number of studies suggest diversity training can activate or cause bias or spark a backlash. That's right, the research shows this kind of instruction can cause more prejudice. Therefore, should we be concerned that the Associate Director, Lila Reed, confirmed to the news media last week that the board does do diversity type training with our students? She said it's done through explicit instruction in, quote, social justice, equity, and inclusion. The subject is included in 2 high school courses among numerous and varied frameworks a teacher can choose to discuss. Given what the research has found about this kind of instruction, shouldn't parents be given the detail? Shouldn't there be discussion? I could go on about other research related to stereotype threat. I don't have time. Instead, let me say this. I've highlighted many studies, those that I was able to find in a day. And it should be clear, much more exploration on these issues was needed and still is needed. And let's remember, your own governing guidelines demand that. Racism is real, and it is harmful. And for our schools to do much better, we must work towards solutions and strategies proven to bring unity. And those solutions need to be based on evidence and open discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. You used your full time. Trustees, are there any questions for this delegate? Trustee Watson has a question.
Thank you. You had mentioned that you were able to find some of these reports, some of this information within a few days. Are you suggesting that there are a lot more reports out there with respect to some of the comments you made?
Yes. For example, Elizabeth Paluk from Princeton, she found 400 studies of this nature. Prior to her study in 2021, she had done an earlier study that found 900. And what she concludes is that the kind of mandatory training that's happening in terms of equity, inclusion, diversity, does not do good. And as Frank Dobbin from Harvard found, it is clear that it can do harm.
Thank you.
Other questions, trustees? Seeing none, your delegation is complete, Mr. Haskell, and you may leave the meeting. Next up, we have